He holds 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in theology. His research interests are quite broad, but for today, what we're going to be focusing on is research interests in the philosophy of time and theology. So what exactly is God's relationship to time?
Yeah, apparently the special theory of relativity has theological implications.
Premise 1. The special theory of relativity is correct in its characterization of time. Premise 2. Premise 1 implies that if God is temporal, then he is at rest in, or exists in, as Craig puts it, either one inertial frame of reference or many different inertial frames of reference. Premise 3, from premises 1 and 2, if God is temporal, then he's at rest in one or more frames of reference. Premise 4, God is not at rest in one or more frames of reference. Conclusion, God is not temporal.
Yeah, look, seriously, I don't care. Maybe you should pad premise 4 just a little. I mean, or, yeah, you probably did, but I was asleep or something. I don't know. I don't care. This is stupid.
Although it may come as something of a shock to many, it seems to me that the most dubious premise in the foregoing argument is premise 1. Although it may come as something of a shock to many, it seems to me that the most dubious premise in the foregoing argument is premise 1.
Okay, maybe this quote from earlier on will show just how stupid this is.
So, if God is in time, then the obvious question raised by STR is, whose time is he in?
Draw a point on a piece of paper. Now draw a coordinate system with an x-axis representing space and a t-axis representing time. The point now represents an occurrence, P, be it an entity or an event, at a location in space at a particular time. Draw another system with a different point of origin at an angle to the first one. Now draw a few more, maybe with some different shapes just for fun. Now tell me, along which t-axis can I find the occurrence P?
All of them! Duh! With this simple question, Craig demonstrates just how poorly he understands the theory, and he's supposed to give a lecture about why he doubts it? It should go without saying that you can't challenge a scientific theory, certainly not one of the cornerstones of physics, when you don't even understand what it says.
In order to understand why I say this, it will be helpful to take a backward glance at Isaac Newton's classical doctrine of absolute time and space, which was superseded by STR. Newton draws a dichotomy with respect to these quantities between absolute and relative, true and apparent. Absolute time and space are constituted by the divine attributes of eternity and omnipresence. Newton's temporal theism thus provides the foundation for absolute simultaneity. What Einstein did, in effect, was simply to remove God from the picture.
No, what Einstein did was point out that the concept of absolute time is useless. A is moving relative to B, and let's define B as being in a state of absolute rest. Well, then B is moving relative to A. And since B is at rest with respect to absolute space and time, it follows that absolute space is moving relative to A. Well, how can absolute space move? We could just as easily define A as being at rest in absolute space, and we would end up with a description of the exact same situation. Bringing God into this isn't going to change anything. Am I moving relative to God and absolute space, or are God and absolute space moving relative to me? Those two are equivalent.
By rejecting Newton's absolute time and space, and along with them, the ether, relativity theory left behind only their empirical measures. Since these are relativized to inertial frames, one ends up with the relativity of simultaneity and of length. What justification did Einstein have for so radical a move?
The observation that the laws of physics appear to be the same in all inertial frames of reference, and that one of these laws appears to be that the speed of light is independent of the relative motion of the observer. This means that the measured length of a time interval, say the time it takes light to travel from a source to a wall and back to the source again, will be different depending on who measures it.
The light has traveled a greater distance in one frame than in the other at the same speed, meaning that more time must have passed in that frame.
It's not that one observer is right and the other is wrong. They're measuring time in different frames of reference. The question, how long did it really take, is nonsensical.
The answer, in a word, is verificationism. Historians of science have demonstrated convincingly that at the philosophical roots of Einstein's
Blah, blah, blah. You don't like Einstein's philosophical views. Irrelevant. As far as I'm concerned, his ideas could have come from an acid trip or a traumatic encounter between an anvil and his head. It doesn't matter. It holds up. This isn't philosophy, it's science. And in science, observable reality is the judge, not the audience, not some professor in a position of authority, not your colleagues, no, not even your imaginary friend.
The whole theory rests upon Einstein's redefinition of simultaneity in terms of clock synchronization via light signals. But that redefinition assumes necessarily that the time which light takes to travel between two relatively stationary observers, A and B, is the same from A to B as from B to A in a round-trip journey. That assumption presupposes that A and B are not both in absolute motion, though relatively stationary with respect to each other.
Then an observer at absolute rest, whatever that means, would measure a difference in travel time, but neither A nor B would, since in their frame of reference the light travels a distance r with a speed c in one direction, and then the same distance r at the same speed c in the other direction. The time it takes is r over c, and since r and c are the same in both directions, of course the difference in travel time is 0.
The reason why they get different measurements is that the speed of light isn't c relative to some medium or absolute space or whatever you want to call it. The speed of light is c relative to every observer. Consider an observer on Earth with a receiver that receives signals from satellites. And these satellites are in geosynchronous orbits, and, well, because the Earth rotates and they remain stationary above a certain point on Earth, they, of course, follow the Earth as it rotates. Now, what that means is that they keep changing direction all the time, so at any given point, a maximum of one of them can be at rest relative to absolute space, assuming that there even is such a thing. Now, have each of these satellites send out signals continuously with information about where they are and what time it is according to the satellite's onboard clock.
If the receiver at a distance r from a satellite picks up a signal at a time t plus delta t, which says that the time is t, we know that the speed of light is r over delta t, which, as it turns out, equals c from all the satellites.
Now, there's an added bonus here, because once we know this, and we do, it's been done, we can actually use this as a navigation system.
We know the time and speed, so we can use that to calculate distance. With the distance from at least 3 satellites known, we can triangulate the receiver's position.
And the funny thing is, your cell phone could act as a receiver and it could do all the math. with a large enough network of satellites, this system could give you your position anywhere on the globe. It would... we could call it a global positioning... Wait.
Lorentzian relativity is admitted on all sides to be at least empirically equivalent to Einsteinian relativity. And there are even indications on the cutting edge of physics today that a Lorentzian view may be preferable in light of recent discoveries. In fact, due to developments in quantum physics, there has been what one participant in the debate has called a sea change in the attitude of the physics community toward Lorentzian relativity.
Source, please. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Lorentz postulates the existence of an ether frame, and we still get the same empirical results as we get from Einstein's theory. Do you understand what that means? It means that even if we assume that an ether frame exists, we end up with the conclusion that there's nothing special about it. Meaning that our choice of ether frame is completely arbitrary. Now, I'm not personally familiar with the mathematics of Lorentzian relativity, but I would imagine that if it's indeed true that it is growing in popularity among scientists, it's probably because it's mathematically convenient for particular applications.
In conclusion, relativity theory does not provide good grounds for thinking that God is timeless.
I agree. It doesn't even address the subject.
Moreover, GTR, in its cosmological application, furnishes us with a cosmic time parameter which may be plausibly interpreted as the appropriate measure of God's time since the moment of creation.
Cosmological time isn't really a single frame of reference. It's the time measured by an observer at rest with respect to the expansion of space at that location. When was it established that God, if he exists, is at rest relative to the expansion of space? And if that's the case, then where? Isn't he omnipresent? He would have to be at rest relative to points that he himself observes to be moving directly away from each other, and that's a contradiction. Bringing general relativity into this doesn't solve anything, Craig. All it does is show that there's another theory you don't know anything about. Now, I find it absolutely hilarious that you call creationists an embarrassment to Christianity because they deny science. You're doing the exact same thing here. When you talk about special relativity, you sound just as stupid as a creationist who talks about evolution. Let me give you a couple of examples. Einstein was a verificationist.
Darwin was a racist. What? I didn't get it. Goddamn Joe stealing.
Special relativity just assumes that the speed of light is invariant.
Now, evolution just assumes the Earth is old.
Absolute time exists even if it can't be measured.
God just made it look like things evolved.
Whose time does God exist in?
If humans came from monkeys, how come they're still monkeys?
Scientists are starting to realize that the ether actually exists.
Now, real scientists, they're discovering that the Bible was right all along.
According to Newton's theory,
Linnaeus, now he was talking about created kinds.
Newton's personal beliefs were that
In the Bible, it says...
you may not be a creationist, Craig, but you certainly seem to act like one. when reality doesn't support your beliefs, you reject reality because you believe what you want to believe because you want to believe it. But they wouldn't pay you to say that, now would they?